John Jumper won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for teaching a neural network to solve a problem that had stumped structural biologists for 50 years, and this week he left DeepMind for Anthropic. Now, the easy read is that Anthropic won a round in the talent war, and sure, that's technically true. But I think if you stop there, you're missing the actually interesting question, which is, what does it mean that the person who built one of the most empirically rigorous AI systems ever constructed chose to work at a safety-focused lab that's currently in an active regulatory fight with the White House? Because Jumper didn't just win a Nobel, he won it for a specific kind of scientific work. And that specificity matters a lot for understanding what this move signals about where the field is going. So let's actually talk about what Jumper built, because I think a lot of coverage skips this part, and it's the whole story. AlphaFold 2, published in Nature in 2021, predicted the three-dimensional structure of proteins from their amino acid sequences. That sounds like a narrow task, but it had been one of biology's central unsolved problems for 5 decades. The reason it was hard is that the number of possible shapes a protein chain can fold into is astronomical. You can't brute force it, and you can't just fit a curve to the data because the data is almost impossibly sparse relative to the search space. What Jumper and his team did, and what set AlphaFold 2 apart from earlier attempts, was embed physical knowledge directly into the model architecture. They used multiple sequence alignments, basically the evolutionary record of how a protein family has changed across species, as a structured input that encodes which positions in a sequence tend to move together. And they built attention mechanisms that operated on that aligned structure, not just on raw sequence tokens. The model wasn't just pattern matching on surface statistics, it was learning representations that had to be consistent with the physical geometry of how atoms actually sit in space. That's a fundamentally different epistemological commitment than training a model to predict the next token in a text corpus. It's not better or worse in the abstract, it's appropriate to the problem. But it shaped how Jumper and his collaborators thought about what a model is for. It's a function that has to produce outputs you can verify against physical reality. And that instinct, build the validation loop first, then trust the model's outputs, is not universal in AI research. It's actually pretty rare. Here's the concrete thing that I keep coming back to. AlphaFold 2 competed in the Cas.4 protein structure prediction contest in 2020, which is the field's established benchmark. Predictions are scored against experimentally determined structures that were withheld from the modelers. AlphaFold 2 achieved median scores that were dramatically higher than any previous method, essentially solving most of the benchmark's categories. And the key word there is experimentally determined. The ground truth came from X-ray crystallography and cryo-electron microscopy, physical measurements of real proteins. The model's outputs were verifiable in a way that meant "we got it right," was an objective statement, not a committee vote. Now contrast that with where alignment and interpretability research sits today. Anthropic does serious work in this space. Their mechanistic interpretability program is genuinely trying to open the black box of how transformer circuits implement behavior. Their constitutional AI approach tries to make model values explicit and auditable. These are real research programs, not marketing. But the honest problem they face is that the validation loop is weak. When you're trying to measure whether a model is aligned, you're largely measuring behavioral proxies. Does it refuse the right prompts? Does it reason consistently in adversarial scenarios? And you don't have a physical reality check the way a crystallographer does. The model could be doing something internally that your evals don't catch, and you'd have no way to know. I think that's actually why Jumper's hire makes sense as a research bet and not just a prestige move. The skill he demonstrated at DeepMind wasn't just deep learning, it was designing systems where you know when you're right. And that skill, applied to alignment research, could be genuinely transformative if it produces the equivalent of crystallography for model internals, some measurement methodology that gives you ground truth about what's happening inside. Okay, but I want to be fair to the skeptical read here because it's a real one. Geoffrey Hinton joined Google years before leaving, and his presence didn't reshape Google Brain's research priorities in any visible near-term way. Nobel laureates are expensive, prestigious, and genuinely smart. And they're also sometimes hired because having them on the org chart is good for recruiting, investor confidence, and press coverage. Given that Anthropic is currently in an ugly fight with the administration over export controls, what they've been calling the Fable ban, the timing of a headline hire isn't coincidental. A Nobel laureate on the team is a credibility signal in a moment when Anthropic needs credibility signals, and I can't rule that out. Jumper hasn't published anything from Anthropic yet. We don't know what his actual mandate is. He might spend the next 2 years on something entirely different from what I've been arguing, and the thesis I'm building here would just be wrong. That's worth sitting with. So here's where I actually land after sitting with both reads. The prestige hire argument is real, but it's not sufficient on its own. Jumper had options. DeepMind, clearly any of the frontier labs, a named chair at a top university. Researchers at his level don't leave Nobel-winning programs for optics alone. They leave because they think the most interesting version of their problem is somewhere else now. And I think there's a coherent story for why Anthropic is that place. It's the lab most explicitly organized around the question of whether AI systems can be made reliably legible and verifiable. That's a question Jumper spent his career developing tools to answer, in a different domain, with different constraints, but the same epistemological shape. The talent gravity story is the one I find myself believing, not because it's flattering to Anthropic, but because it explains the choice better than the alternatives. And if it's right, it compounds. Researchers who care about rigorous methodology and real validation loops are going to keep gravitating toward labs with long horizon mandates, because that's where the problems that require that kind of rigor actually live. That's a structural shift, not a news cycle. The Fable ban is a fight that'll resolve one way or another in the next year or two. Jumper's presence at Anthropic is a 5-year research bet. If the thesis here is right, you'll start seeing it show up in Anthropic's published work. Papers on interpretability that borrow methodology from structural biology, or attempts to build evaluation frameworks that have the same ground truth properties that Casp had for protein prediction. If you're watching for one signal, that's the one I'd track. Does Anthropic's mechanistic interpretability program start publishing work that cites physical-constraint methodology in 18 months? If it does, this wasn't a prestige hire. That's your evening context. See you tomorrow.